look at this storm in particular, hydropower accounted for over 95% of the load in our balancing authority at certain times. So, overall, when we look at hydropower, it's both a reliable baseload resource, but can also be dispatched to run when the power is not needed. We were able to move around our generation to be able to meet the changing needs of the system.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. Back in January, the Northwest experienced a frigid winter storm. Temperatures plummeted, snow and freezing rain wreaked havoc for days on end, and we were faced with costly, even deadly outcomes. The extreme cold temperatures put an enormous strain on our grid as well. Energy usage skyrocketed as people made every effort to keep their homes warm, and many were stuck inside for days on end as the icy conditions prevented them from safely stepping beyond their own front door. Power outages due to storm damage did occur, but we narrowly avoided any kind of blackouts due to a shortage of energy. In the days and weeks following the storm, we learned that hydropower played a critical role in this happening. The story, as you'll hear today, is well worthy of an episode here on DAM, and I'm excited to share that story with you all. I'm also very excited to introduce you to today's guest, Michelle Cathcart, who comes to us as the Vice President of Generation Asset Management from the Bonneville Power Administration, and who made the journey to be with us here today in person. Michelle, it's an honor to have you on DAM.
Thank you.
We throw around Bonneville or BPA in discussions a lot on this podcast, but it might be helpful for our audience if we could give them maybe a brief description of what the Bonneville Power Administration actually is.
Sure. So BPA is a power marketing administration, part of the federal government, and really we have two major roles. The planning and marketing of the power from the Federal Columbia River Power System, which includes 31 dams and a nuclear plant, as well as owning and operating over 15,000 miles of transmission across the Northwest to deliver the power from those dams to end users. We also hold environmental responsibilities to mitigate the impacts of the federal power and transmission system, and we perform all of these functions leveraging sound business principles. BPA customers are generally the local utilities. I liken us to the interstate highway of power. We take the generation and move it long distances to get it to local utilities, who can then serve the needs of local businesses and homeowners. So you as a citizen don't get a bill from BPA as a residential ratepayer, but your local utility bill will include BPA costs for that generation and or transmission. And those bills will be among the lowest in the nation due to our abundance of low-cost, reliable hydropower.
And we are definitely fans of that here. And I think it's safe to say, as you mentioned there in that while it may be worthwhile to operate in sort of a business-minded way, you're not a private business at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah.
And as far as your role itself, being Vice President of Generation Asset Management, what does that current role look like at Bonneville?
So as the VP of Generation Asset Management, I have a 24/7 real-time staff that manage the operation of the Federal Columbia River Power System, as well as several support organizations that run studies, manage fish operations, perform asset management training, all of that sort of stuff.
And as I understand it, your background in energy is pretty broad as well. Can we talk maybe a little bit about what other areas of focus you've emphasized in the past in your career?
Sure. So I mentioned that BPA has two major roles, power and transmission. So in my current role, I'm over a part of the power operations. And my previous position was Vice President of Transmission System Operations. So I've been in my current role for about 7 months now, and was in transmission for about 7 years. There's a lot of similarities between the power role and the transmission role. In transmission, I also had a 24/7 group that managed the transmission system and supported and had support organizations that, for example, ran studies, supported training and tools, etc.
And it makes, perfect sense that you would need to have 24/7 in that situation, right? I mean, these are things that are constantly in use, even when maybe the majority of us are asleep at night, right?
Right.
Now, as far as kind of framing today's actual conversation, going back to about a month ago when we were hit with that storm that I mentioned in the intro, take me through what that event looked like from your perspective in your role.
So we have a team of meteorologists on staff that provide us with weather forecasts and information. So we saw this storm coming around 2 weeks ahead of time. So we also then from that weather forecast, we have load forecasters that determine what our load or demand is expected to be based on those weather conditions. We also have a group of hydrologists that then also turn those weather forecasts into stream flow forecasts. So we know what the river is going to be doing and have an idea of how we can manage and plan for the actual operation of the dams. So this advanced forecasting gave us the ability to plan for the event. So restricting maintenance, moving outages, etc., so that our system could be as robust as possible during the actual event. As the event unfolded and evolved, those forecasts are continually updated, and we adjusted our generation accordingly. On the transmission side, they were dealing with the transmission lines that went out of service due to wind, falling limbs, ice, etc. And they were constantly adjusting the system so that it would stay reliable for the next contingency. And our crews braved the weather and were dispatched out to fix the physical damage on our transmission system. So it really takes a village to manage this sort of event.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I had a friend who I was on the phone with during kind of the beginning of the storm when it was really kicking off, and we were both just kind of in awe, looking outside the windows like, do you see what's going on out here type of thing. And then he lost power, and he was down in Portland. So he was Portland General Electric service territory, and they were having a lot of issues down there, obviously with all the falling trees and whatnot. But it was kind of funny because he goes, what do you think this is going to get, like, when is this going to get fixed? And I was like, well, they have crews that work on this, right, as you're mentioning. But they will go out and brave the storm and go out there, but there also is kind of this balance of safety aspect as well, where you can't put people in totally outrageously dangerous positions at the same time, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Safety is one of BPA's core values, one of our most important core values. And so we do have to manage that balance. We work to restore power as quickly as possible, but we won't send crews into very dangerous situations. And so we need to make sure to keep our folks safe. I think about, when you go on an airplane and they say put on your mask before you help someone else. Right. So we have to protect our crews, both obviously because it's important to protect them, but also, I think from an end user perspective, we need them to stay safe so that they can continue to do that important work of restoring transmission.
Yeah, that 100% makes sense to me. As far as, when you're planning for this, I know that you mentioned you kind of forecast maybe like 2 weeks in advance, but where does that plan start getting put into place, where you start saying, okay, like, this is what we likely need to do in order to make sure we're ready when the storm actually hits?
Well, I think there's a couple of different layers. We are constantly studying our system and evaluating what's necessary. So, we start with a resource program that looks out about 20 years to see what our power needs are going to be in the future. We're also joining the Western Resource Adequacy Program. That program is still being implemented, but it will help support resource adequacy, meaning that we have enough generation as a region. And so we see those kind of longer term planning as a really important step. But as we look at getting closer to an actual specific storm, yes, the weather forecasting starts about 2 weeks out. Once we have that weather forecasting, the stream flow forecast, the load forecast, and we put that all together to see we got to do something, We do a lot of coordination, both between power and transmission, as well as other local utilities. So in this example, we coordinated with BC Hydro in British Columbia on some of the treaty flows that were expected to be, and whether there were any flexibilities available with that relationship. We also communicate with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, who actually operate the physical dams themselves, to see where we can move some of the outages and what flexibility we have at the dams themselves. And beyond that, we continue also to coordinate with our neighboring balancing authorities and transmission operators. We also worked with Energy Northwest, who runs the nuclear plant, to declare the restricted maintenance at Columbia Generating Station. There were also restricted maintenance operations across our footprint. And when we look at this pre-event operations, we position ourselves with the water to make sure that we're maximizing the capacity and energy based on the prevailing hydraulic constraints. So this includes coordinating release from some of the headwater projects, because as you think about the water coming down the river, it goes from dam to dam. So we need to manage the entire system together. We also work with our marketing team to make sure that if we need it, we know how to respond or request emergency energy if that were to come up. And then during operational hours, we have specific actions that the teams follow to get through these events and respond to unexpected load overruns or generation loss. This year has been a dry water year, so that adds further complications. In general, we have less energy flexibility because of the dry water year. And we also have to think about the trade-offs between right now and the rest of the year, because we do have energy storage projects where we need to make sure that we have enough water for getting through the heat of the summer and things like that. So we think about how to balance all of those needs together.
And so let me ask, when you're talking about, as you mentioned, capacity, I mean, that's essentially what you're trying to get at there, right? Is like how much is actually available.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an interesting thing that you're talking about here, is that need to balance what we can use now versus what we need to have for later, essentially. I'd be kind of curious, and maybe we won't get into the specific details, but kind of talking about it at a higher level. At what point do you kind of say, like, okay, we really don't have maybe more to spare here, for example, if we need to generate as much energy as possible in an event like this?
Well, I think we really tried to balance it out. For example, one of the things that we did during this storm is that we increased generation during the day and decreased it at night, both because loads are higher in the day, but also making sure that we're maximizing the usage during the peak times, and can buy cheaper power in the off-peak hours. So that's kind of what we do in terms of the balancing within the storm. When we look at kind of the long-term needs of the system, we do have certain targets at different times of the year. So we work to make sure that we have enough water to meet those targets that are in the rest of the water year.
And then I also wanted to ask you too, when I looked at some of the numbers that came out kind of post-storm, one of the things I saw was this incredible load, right? This incredible amount of megawatts that were in demand.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious for the forecasting side of things. I mean, was that something that you saw coming, or was it even kind of a surprise maybe that we peaked out as high as we did?
We did predict that it was going to be a very high load. And I think that we look at load a couple of different ways. And we look at the load that's served by the actual dams themselves. We look at the load that our power organization is responsible for, which can include power purchase, et cetera. And we also look at load from a balancing authority perspective, which is a transmission look at how we need to balance load and generation for the region. And for our balancing authority, we did hit a modern peak. And the reason I use that word is because we did have higher peaks back when we had aluminum smelters on the system. But since those have retired, this has been the new peak from a balancing authority perspective. And there were peaks set in multiple places across our system.
That certainly makes sense. And you talked a lot about both the sort of generation response that took place, as well as some of those infrastructure impacts and trying to move things around to be able to avoid as much outage as possible. But one of the things you brought up was even just the location of where some of the dams are relative to where some of that transmission infrastructure is and things like that, how important that can be. And it's something that we talk a lot about, is the value of our hydropower being local, right? And having it in a place where we have, access to it, just in the surrounding communities. And so I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, maybe some of the value that was there and how you were able to utilize some of those dams strategically based on their location to be able to help assist in the response to the storm.
Yeah, so one of the areas that we pay attention to from a transmission perspective is the Tri-Cities area. And Ice Harbor Dam is in that area and is an important part of just both providing the actual energy, but also the voltage support. And voltage support is a critical part of maintaining the reliability and stability of the system. So the Ice Harbor Dam helps to provide that kind of ancillary benefit as well, voltage support in that very local region. Because voltage support is not something that you can kind of push across wide areas. It's a localized issue.
I get the sense that maybe sometimes people look at the grid and almost in maybe like a Lego, like building block sort of way, where it's like, we can take these ones out here, move these ones around, you can kind of tweak individual components. And is it safe to say that it's more interconnected than that, in the sense that, the transmission lines, for example, there's a reason kind of things are playing and connecting with one another the way that they are?
Yeah, so our area is in what's known as the Western Interconnection, which is basically the U.S. west of the Rockies, along with BC, Alberta, and a little bit of Mexico. And so all of that Western Interconnection area is connected through AC transmission lines. And so generally speaking, if there's not congestion on the transmission system, we can work together to support different areas. We can leverage the diversity of the weather across different areas. But there are times where things get congested, just like if you hit a traffic jam, right? It's not as easy to get certain places. And so the transmission system is very similar to that.
I really have to say I love that example that you just shared, because I think we've all been there at some point where, you get into like a traffic jam on the freeway, and then your map tells you to hop off on a side street. And you're thinking you have it beat, and then you find out that there's one four-way intersection on that side street that has you backed up for however many miles. And so I think people can maybe wrap their heads around that one, because we've all been there, right? As far as the comparison to maybe like previous weather events that we've had in just the past few years, really, maybe kind of speaking modernly, like you were with the aluminum smelter, for example. Right. How did this one kind of compare to some of those past events?
So this cold snap presented meteorological conditions that have not been seen since about 2004 in terms of the duration and the severity of the weather event. There was a slightly more severe cold snap in 2008, but that one was only 2 days long. Mm-hmm. So when we look at both the duration and the severity, this has been quite a big one. So anyway, as I mentioned, we do look at load in different ways. So in this event for our balancing authority area, we did hit a modern peak load of 11,396 megawatts during the morning of January 13th. The previous post aluminum peak load record was set on December 22nd, 2022 at 11,068 megawatts. But when we look at an all-time peak, including the aluminum smelters, the record was set in 1990 with 11,930 megawatts. Again, all of that's from the balancing authority perspective.
That being said, I mean those numbers are all pretty close together. We're not talking about a few thousand difference, right? So it, in some ways, does speak to, and some of it obviously can be attributed to growth in the region and electrification that's taking place, but it speaks to the fact that, modernly, even without those smelters in place, we're still hitting some pretty high numbers, it sounds like.
Yes, definitely.
And I recall seeing that I think like 49 out of 50 states during that same week were actually experiencing some sort of adverse weather. Does that have an impact on us in the Northwest when we're up against a challenge of this scale?
Yes and no. I would say, like I mentioned, the Western interconnection. When the Western interconnection is all experiencing that sort of cold snap, which we were, then it can be impactful. We're less impacted by like East Coast types of weather and issues. But when we look at this area. For example, when it's cold in the Northwest but sunny and warm in California, we can import a bunch of power, or vice versa. If it's very hot in California and moderate here, we can export a lot of power. So, this goes to the ability to support each other within that Western interconnection when the impact isn't as widespread. When it is a significant cold snap across so many states, then it can be harder to find that support from others.
That certainly makes sense, and given what we were experiencing, it makes sense that it might be a little bit more challenging to rely on them. I think some of our friends in like Montana, for example, were down to like negative 40 or negative 50 with wind chill and all that factored in. Something that you brought up there, though, that I think is really important to touch on. Because I even answered a question about it this morning. Actually, I was speaking at a local Rotary Club here in town, and by the way, shout out to them. They were such fantastic people and very inviting and welcoming. But they had a number of questions. They were very engaged in the discussion, and one of the things that came up after I'd spoken was somebody wanted to know what essentially our relationship is with California, and do we sell power to California? And I was kind of explaining yes, we do, but I kind of know where that question goes almost, right? And so I wanted to make sure to explain we do sell that power, but we also receive power in return, and we're not looking at it as kind of an us versus them situation, but more trying to make sure that we all as a Western region, right, are able to sustain ourselves. And is there any way you can maybe touch on that a little bit and kind of share just from Bonneville's perspective the relationship that we have with kind of our neighbors here on the West Coast?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of important points there. One is that when Bonneville does sell our power, it's the kind of leftover power. So we work to make sure that we're meeting our local needs first. And then if we can support California in various instances, then we will sell them power. And we get revenue from that. They get benefit from that. And like you say, it really is a mutual relationship. So during this event, for example, we were regularly importing about 3,000 megawatts from California at a number of different times. So their support was definitely helpful. We do that in kind to them too, and work together.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard is people will kind of say, you guys have a surplus of power. And there's a difference in having extra when we have it, versus like we have too much, almost, if that makes sense. And I think that it's important to make that distinction, because when we get into a situation like this, we're not looking at a situation where we just go, oh, no worries, well, we have that big surplus of power over here that we're just going to pull in and the day's going to be saved. So there was some data that circulated during all of this kind of aftermath that has been able to show how much hydropower generation played a large role in meeting increased demand. Why hydropower in particular?
Well, I think, as we talked about, hydropower is a big resource that we have with a lot of ability to provide that base load. So overall, hydropower accounts for about 43% of generation in the Northwest and 83% of BPA's overall fuel mix. When we look at this storm in particular, hydropower accounted for over 95% of the load in our balancing authority at certain times. Overall, when we look at hydropower, it's both a reliable baseload resource, but can also be dispatched to run when the power is not needed. So I talked a little bit about how we ramped it up during the day and ramped it back down at night. So having that capability is really important. And then also the ancillary services such as the voltage support in the Tri-Cities area.
Real quickly, do you think you could just kind of quickly define what base load is for our audience, just to make sure people kind of understand what that term is referencing to?
Sure. So if you think about it, every time you turn on the light, right, that means that there's a little bit more power that's needed from the grid. Lots of people turn off and on their lights throughout the day, so there's a lot of variation throughout the day. But base load is essentially the power that we need on a regular basis, and supporting the sort of everyday needs. So that's where hydropower can come in and provide us with a clean power source to meet that sort of base load.
That makes sense. As far as the maybe reasons why hydropower was useful in a situation like this, are there specific attributes to that form of generation that were helpful in meeting some of these demand challenges?
Yeah, I think that the fact that we can dispatch it as we need it is a really important piece of it. So I listened to your Hydropower 101 from a couple of weeks ago. I think that you talked a little bit there about some of the storage facilities that we have and the ability to ramp those up and down. So we were able to move around our generation to be able to meet the changing needs of the system. So that's an important piece. We can rely on it regardless of the weather for that base load capacity. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. During this storm, there was a lot of wind where I live. I'm kind of right in the gorge a little bit, and so I was getting hit with a lot of that, which was pretty intense. At the same time, when I look at the data, what shows up on the graph there is that wind generation was dropping significantly during those few days. Is there a reason that maybe points to why, even though we're seeing something like high wind here, why we wouldn't be seeing that kind of translating to wind, and why a lot of times in these really cold or really hot events we're just not seeing those resources generating as much?
Yeah, so if you think back to the wind that you experienced, most likely what you saw was during those couple of days just before and at the very beginning of the cold snap that you probably saw that wind happening, and then it really did drop off. So when we look backwards at historical data, we can see that when the weather is below 30 degrees or above 90 degrees in Portland, wind capacity factors are around 2% or less for the wind. in the balancing authority. When I talked to our meteorologist about kind of the physics of why this is, the short answer is that wind is caused by differences in temperature air masses. So if you think about kind of that beginning of the storm, the cold was coming in from the east, but it was warmer on the west side, and so that creates some of that wind. But once it gets cold on the west side as well, then you lose that temperature difference. And the wind fleet in the Pacific Northwest is mostly concentrated in the area near the Columbia River Gorge. And one of the things that we've observed is that during extreme cold or extreme warm events, the temperature differences between the east side of the Cascades and the west side of the Cascades diminishes. And I think that when you think about some of these big weather events, it does encompass both the east and the west side. And the other piece of it too is that the west side of our system is where more of our load is. And so the impact of the weather is greater when it is on the west side of the Cascades. And so that's when that temperature difference doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that actually is really, I'm wrapping my head around that and thinking about that a lot, and it's making a ton of sense to me. And I want to be very careful in how I word this because I don't want to overgeneralize, right? But a lot of the wind turbines that I see here in the region happen to be either like when I'm driving down 84, going out to the eastern side of the region, or maybe like coming through I-90, which is kind of a similar corridor there. And it would make sense that those resources might be positioned in such a way to capture maybe the difference that's taking place between the east and west side and the temperatures on either side of the Cascades. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that comes into, those end up being the windiest places. And so as wind developments come up, obviously they want to be where it's windy.
Yeah. And as you're describing it, it sounds like basically when it's kind of neutral, right? Like we're experiencing the same thing on the west side as they are on the east side, and you don't have wind coming through maybe those corridors where we normally expect it.
Right.
When it comes to maybe other ways that this stuff could have impacted us beyond, that, when you're talking about other pieces of infrastructure, certainly like we're not too worried about freezing rain falling on the outside of a dam, right? But are there other areas that maybe some of that freezing rain did have an impact where it was especially burdensome on the grid?
Yeah, from a transmission perspective, there were a lot of issues, both from falling limbs as well as the icing on some of our transmission facilities. There was damage to some transformers that we had, as well as just being heavily loaded because of the high demand that we had. We had a number of equipment alarms across our transmission system. Disconnects were freezing, lines relayed due to snow-laden trees. Some facilities even had multiple trips due to snow-laden trees. So if trees getting heavy, then it can impact the same line multiple times, and we would send crews out there to check it out. The Tri-Cities area set a winter load record even with some of the equipment failures. In Salem and the Eugene area, there was extended ice storm with freezing rain and high temperatures. So initially there were 10 high voltage lines that relayed out of service due to icing and falling trees, and a number of line impacts, 49 line outages on 34 lines, with 45 points of delivery being restored in that Salem-Eugene area. And more than an inch of ice coated portions of Lane County, followed by days of freezing temperatures and a second bout of freezing rain. So all of that builds on top of each other. And our transmission crews were fabulous working through all of the impacts to our system. We also have mutual assistance agreements with several other utilities. So we were able to, once we got our system put back together, we were able to provide support to other utilities in the Northwest and across our system.
Looking ahead to the future, are there important lessons to be learned for our region and things that we can take away having been through this experience now and, really, dealt with a storm that kind of, in some ways, was almost a little bit unprecedented?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the coordination that we had and all of the communication really paid off, as well as the advanced planning. So making sure that the river is set up for the increased loads, making sure that our system is as robust as possible, and that we're not taking outages during that time. All of those are things that we've been doing in practice, but are important to continue doing as we move forward. So, and I think that a lot of what we saw is things that we've been doing for a while. And I think that we'll continue to do that. There are we've seen lessons learned coming out nationwide from various ice storms. So I think the most recent before this was from some of the cold weather in Texas. And we, as a utility industry, we share those lessons learned widely so that we can all, it's better to learn from somebody else's issues than from your own. So I think that's been very helpful as we've thought about setting our system and our coordination. There have also been some changing reliability standards from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is our regulator for the electric industry, and they are working to help us all learn from events across this system. For the general public, I would say it's a good reminder to have backup plans and resources at home. Our teams do a tremendous amount of work trying to restore power as quickly and safely as possible, but there's no way to prevent all outages. I think that really being prepared as individuals is also a really important thing as we see these in the future.
That is something I'd like to expand on a little bit with you, is that just this morning when I was discussing this storm as part of the presentation I gave, one of the things that I brought up is, the fact that statistically speaking, we know at least as far as the latest reporting I saw, 17 people passed away in this storm. And, hypothermia being one of them, falling trees being another, but there were people who were electrocuted during the storm. And, I think it speaks to, as you're saying, the preparedness of knowing, what to do in these situations and how to, come out on top of it, essentially. But is there somewhere, if people want to learn about, like, how to be more safe, how to be more prepared in these situations? I mean, are there different resources you could at least point to that might, help people just even to learn basic safety, like to not go near a downed line, right?
Yeah, not going near a downed line is always the right decision. It may be de-energized by having fallen down, but it's better to be safe than sorry in that case. So always maintaining a safe distance from any downed power lines. If a power line were to fall on your car, you want to actually stay in the car because the rubber tires help to protect you. So there's a lot of good concepts like that it's good for the general public to be aware of. In terms of kind of general emergency preparedness, I always like ready.gov. It's a fantastic website that has resources for all different sorts of emergencies and different ideas for the public to be prepared.
Perfect. Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that because, again, I think for some people, we know there's people out there who are like hyper-focused on this, right? They're always, preparing for whatever could be coming down the road. But there's other people who probably wouldn't even know where to start to look. So I'm glad we can kind of get that message out as part of this today. Along those lines, what should we be cautious of in the future when faced with similar circumstances?
I think it really is about preparedness and preparing for different outcomes. I think, when I look at my personal life, the ice on my hill lasted longer than I expected it to. And making sure that as individuals we have the resources that we need for potentially changing situations is really important. And it's better to plan for more than what you think you will need in order to be prepared.
Certainly. I have two kind of follow-up questions a little bit in line with some of this that we're talking about that came to mind. One of them is in terms of looking to the future, looking to a future where, as we are talking about, the potential climate impacts and the increase of more, extreme weather events maybe taking place. Are there things we can learn from a cold snap that we can maybe apply to a heat wave? Are there similarities in these two types of events where we're able to take lessons from one and apply them to the next?
There are some. I think that the biggest thing is looking at the way that we coordinate for high demand. That's from a utility perspective. That's the biggest similarity between cold snaps and heat waves. Is that high level of demand, understanding where our system is more robust or maybe not as robust, and figuring out the operating plans that are necessary for those different high load situations. So, when we look at BPA, I think that some of our procedures and processes that we have are applicable in any high load situation. And we can use those. Of course, there's a lot of differences too in terms of the weather. Generally, when it's a heat wave perspective, wildfire is a potential issue that we could be concerned with, whereas in a cold snap, the impact can be the ice on the system as well as the dangerous conditions for line crews to get out there.
Going kind of from that, one of the things that we have seen a lot, or at least I've seen a lot here at this organization and talking with people out in the public, is when they hear about climate change, when they hear about extreme weather and heat and all these things that we may be facing in the near or long-term future, they say, well, I'm reading stuff that's telling me that the rivers are drying up, that we can't, we won't be able to use hydropower moving forward. And, you talked about the balancing of capacity and everything like that, and this being a dry water year, for example. Do we see those kind of concerns with our hydropower system here as far as them, not being operational essentially due to drought, where, maybe we've seen some of those examples in the Southwest and in the desert? Or, do you feel, can you speak maybe to Bonneville's position, I suppose, as far as, what our outlook is for the future of hydropower and our ability to continue using these resources?
I would say that the Columbia Basin is a pretty robust basin, even in a dry year like this. We do still produce quite a bit of our power out of our hydro system. As we continue modeling, we will always be looking at that in terms of what resources we may need in the future. At this point, I continue to see hydropower as an important piece of our baseload capacity and meeting the needs of the Northwest.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As far as where people can go to learn about BPA's work, I mean, I've learned so much today from you being here, and I hope that our audience has as well. But if people are curious, if they want to kind of keep this going and they want to dive more deeply into BPA and what you do, what's the best place that they can go to do that?
We have a lot of resources on our website, which is www.bpa.gov. And so that's a great place to look for information. You can also follow us on Facebook under Bonneville Power Administration. And we provide a lot of information on some of the near-term things that are happening. And we provide updates on storm restoration in some cases and things like that too.
Perfect. Is there anything exciting going on at BPA that you'd like to share with our audience that maybe we didn't get to touch on today?
Yeah, I think that we're really at the crux of a lot of change in a number of different ways. So, here we've been talking about some of the climate change. We also see electrification and decarbonization as significant changes to the energy utilities in general. And a lot is still unknown about, there's just a lot of uncertainty about what that will totally mean. So we're participating in a number of different groups that are looking at those issues so that we can stay on top of the potential impact of those. We also are exploring day-ahead markets. That's been an effort throughout the West, and we are continuing to look at what the value of day-ahead markets might be, and we're looking to make some decisions around that later this year, and we'll be able to share more information about that as that goes forward.
Great. Thank you so much. One last thing that we have here on the podcast is really a big goal of DAM is to be able to tell the stories of the unsung heroes of the grid, right? And a big part of that is we want people to actually get to know the people behind this industry and behind the work that's taking place. And so we always like to kind of close out every episode by taking a step back from the actual kind of deep dive discussion that we always get into and just get back to our guest and letting people know who you are. And so the way that I like to do that is to kind of put you on the spot a little bit, which some people appreciate and some people don't, and I'd certainly get both sides of it. But the way we do that is just I open up the floor and give all of our guests the opportunity to share a little bit of life advice, essentially, something that maybe is important to you, something you like to live by, or maybe something you recently discovered that's kind of spoken to you in some kind of way. And, just give you the opportunity to share that with some people and maybe extend that advice to others.
I think the thing that resonates most with me in that respect is value people. That's one of the core points that we make at Bonneville, and I think that it really applies to life in general, because I think that demonstrating the care that you have for people is really important as we continue as a community. And when I think about my work day to day, that's one of the most important things to me, is making sure that my people are cared for, and that I'm clearing obstacles for them and giving them what they need to be successful, because they really are the ones that are doing the day-to-day work that keeps the power flowing across the Northwest. I think it also applies in personal life too. Demonstrating that value for friends, family, etc. is really important to maintain your relationships. Because at the end of the day, that's the basis of so much that all of us do.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, frankly, I don't think I've ever disagreed with a single guest in their advice. I think I say that every time. But nonetheless, I think so much of what makes public power special, so much of what makes, kind of the Northwest and our energy situation special in general, is that so many of us are service-minded. And, we're trying to serve each other and bolster the community, and the whole rising tide lifts all ships type of mentality. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Sure.
And I really appreciate you for being here so much. It's so great to be able to have somebody from Bonneville on. I think we talk so much about the work that your organization does on the podcast, but seldom do we get the opportunity to actually speak directly with somebody there. So really excited about that, and look forward to getting to maybe share some more stories from Bonneville in the future as well. And I appreciate you being here in person. It's always fun to have people in the studio and actually get to record face to face. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I owe a huge thanks to Michelle for joining us on this very important episode of DAM, and for making the trip to the very humble DAM HQ studio. Likewise, there are a few other individuals who helped in making this all happen, though because I'm not sure they actually want a shout out, I'm going to hold off on that. But hey, you know who you are, and my thanks could not be more sincere. Now, every episode of DAM is packed full of details and information on whichever subject we're discussing. And on the one hand, this is great because we have a platform that allows us to explore well beyond bullet points and slide decks. On the other hand, though, I think that sometimes this can be a bit hard, as it's difficult to retain everything you just heard over the past 45 minutes or hour, or sometimes an hour and a half. That's why I like to throw in these little wrap-ups at the end. And I think today the message that I want to send everyone off with is to recognize the gravity of how important today's discussion was. The storm in January could have been far more impactful than it was, and our hydropower resources were heavily relied on to avoid a power shortage disaster. Sure, the system is great at its usual day-to-day supply of energy that we all utilize, but these critical moments when our dams rise to the occasion should not be overlooked. That said, if you find yourself looking for more information from today's discussion, or if you have questions for us, simply head over to our contact form on nwriverpartners.org. You can also email us directly at info@nwriverpartners.org. I always encourage everyone to write in, as we love to hear what you think of the podcast, what recommendations you have for future episodes, and anything else on your mind. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform to help us grow our audience. And while you're there, don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes, which arrive every other Friday. Lastly, be sure to follow us at NW River Partners on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We've got some really great episodes coming your way soon, so please join us again in 2 weeks. And until then, see ya.